Happy New Year, happy 2023, and welcome to Meadowlarkers 60, our first of the year. We have a quorum. We have a cleanly coiffed Amin
Wait,
Elhassan.
we're 61.
No, we're 60.
No, we're 61. I did 60 without y'all.
Oh, you did 60 without? Oh my God, that is
Yeah.
that's right. You did 60.
And it was Chuck Bednarik.
From the Eagles and Garen Barris and Chris Samuels. This is great because 1960 was probably my weakest number. But when you've got the Hall of Famer Chuck Bednarik, you're in good shape. But we are at Meadowlarkers 61. I stand corrected, and at 61.
You got to put an asterisk now next to the 61.
Exactly. A 60. That's a great call by you. A Roger Maris asterisk goes by 61. Our first Meadowlarkers of the year, honorary captains for 61. Let's go. Obviously, the Roger Maris asterisk is great. We can also go Chan Ho Park, pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers. We could also throw 61, 61, 61. You can also throw Bronson Arroyo in there. Jesse Sapolo, offensive lineman for San Francisco 49ers, 61. Nate Newton was also 61. Dallas Cowboys, was he not?
This is how we know you don't Google, because you thought it was 60. And so you're just pivoting. This is all extemporaneous for the listeners. Yeah.
Will you finally believe me now, Kate?
I do now. I do.
Yes. And there is also the great Russian hockey player whose last name I cannot pronounce, but I will have it for the end of the show. Maxim Buffalo Sabres, 61. We'll get to that one anyway. Not a fun topic this week, talking about Damar Hamlin, which is the story in sports this week, and so many different thoughts and questions. And also, when you get to the point, the end of the week, with all of the commentary and all of the thoughts, there is a fear of redundancy, but it also feels very important for us to talk about this a bit. I actually had some thoughts. I thought that one of the areas worth discussing was our own culpability in sports, about sports, and about how we watch sports, how we view sports, how we ingest these games, and at what price. I went out on Monday to go have dinner with a friend of mine, and when I got home, Bomani Jones called, and Bomani called and said, "Hey, are you watching this game?" And I was like, "Oh, Monday night game?" I was like, "No." And he's like, "I think a guy died on the field." I mean, that's how I found out. I wasn't watching the game. I never saw the hit. I didn't see any of that. Bomani called me. I turned the TV on, and then you see the ambulance on the field, and you see the players circling Damar Hamlin. And at that moment, there were so many different thoughts that went through my mind. One of the very first things was, at this stage, if ever there was a time for leadership, it is right now. And how is this playing out in real time? This is one of the things we say is one of the great things about sports, is that it's not scripted. Well, in a moment like this, it absolutely was not scripted. And we got to see the wheels in motion of what a juggernaut industry does and operates, and how it operates in a crisis. I mean, you've been talking about this all week as well. Could you just run us through quickly? Were you watching the game, and what were your immediate thoughts on that immediate aftermath?
I was on my way to a local sports bar to meet some friends to watch the game. While I was there, in one of the group chats I'm in, someone said, "Holy!"
So the game had already started.
The game had already started. It was Miami traffic, so I was late. But in the group chat, it's like, "Holy hell, someone just died," and I thought that was just the vernacular of, "Oh man, they really lit him up" or something, until they say he's not moving, and I say, "Oh wait, do you mean he's literal? There's someone literally." So they're administering CPR right now, and I said, "Okay, that doesn't sound good." So I got to the sports bar, and all the TVs had the game on, and same thing. I'm seeing the images of an ambulance on the field. I'm seeing players in a prayer circle, and then we cut to studio. Obviously, there's no volume, so I have no idea what they're saying. But in my mind, I'm thinking, look, there's not many updates you can provide in a moment like this. So they're just filling time until we figure out if this game is going to resume or not.
And Amin, just to follow up, because I know you've been on air a lot over the last couple of days, like what has been, as you've talked about this, what topics, what angles have you felt like are have been the most for you fertile ground to be able to like have this conversation?
What the operating procedure in an event like this, you know, it hasn't happened, but or if it's happened once before, I believe, but I kind of find it hard to believe, regardless of what we are privy to as a public, that in the, you know, the highest levels of the NFL, they haven't come forward with the plan of action in the event that someone is, you know, is incapacitated to that level, to the point where do we see loss of life? What do you do? If they don't have a standard operating procedure for that, or a plan of action for that eventuality, that would shock me, because we know where this sport is headed. Even though, to be honest with you, as we find out the details of what happened to Hamlin, it's not what I would have ever imagined. I said this on LeBatard Show on Tuesday. If on Monday morning you told me, hey, there's going to be a player who is going to need to be resuscitated on the field after a play, and then was asked to describe what the play would look like, I would have imagined a head-to-head collision and, you know, something like a helmet exploding, you know, something grandiose. And when you see the actual play, it look, if he hadn't collapsed, we wouldn't have thought twice about that hit. And it turns out that apparently what happened wasn't the, you know, an extremely violent hit. It was a hit that happened at an extraordinarily precise moment of vulnerability in between the heartbeats, right? The exact millisecond. And it's akin to, was it Christian Pronger?
Erickson?
Oh, no, Christian Eriksen, the soccer player, but no, but who was the hockey player who got hit with the puck?
Hopefully there you go, Pronger.
Chris Pronger got hit with in the chest with a puck and had something similar. Now he you know, ended up being okay afterward. I know that it's been something in Little League baseball where now the kids all have to wear like a protective, you know, flak jacket or something like that underneath, because we had players get hit by line drives in the chest and go into cardiac arrest. But all of that notwithstanding, whether it was the violence of the sport that did it or just an incredibly bad luck in terms of the timing of the hit, the fact of the matter remains, anyone watching the NFL, at least for the last 10 years, knows this sport is dangerous, might be dangerous on the highest level, and the cost of human life.
Yeah.
So the idea that the commissioner's office and the league don't have a specific plan of action in the eventuality that this might happen, even if it never happened, I would be surprised about that. And to be honest with you, watching Monday night, it did not feel like they had a plan of action.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, this idea, I think there's a lot of places for us to go after this, but I think the point of like this official, the way I picture it, and I'll wrap this around, the way I picture it is like there should actually be like a binder in the NFL offices that have like laid out step by step. I'm not saying this does exist, but considering everybody who, as you mentioned, I mean, everybody in the last 15 years, whether sports media or fans of the NFL, you have had the conversation with a friend or a colleague of what will happen the day an NFL player dies on national TV during the middle of a game. So you must then map that idea onto the NFL offices and think there has got to be a 200-page binder here is what we do step by step. I mean, are you okay?
No, I was gonna say, yeah, like
Okay,
you
okay,
break the
okay.
glass and everyone
Yeah.
puts their two keys in and we turn the key and it comes
And you
out of
have
like
it.
a
And it's the minutes after from like, here's what we do about the current game that's being played. Here's what we do the hour after here. And it should be laid out. And I'm reminded, I don't know if either of you watched 5 Days at Memorial. It was an Apple TV show about a hospital in Katrina where the generators were underwater and, you know, they have terminally ill patients they're trying to care for. So they're in triage mode and they have an actual binder for like what happens when the flooding reaches 3 feet. Okay. And they're flipping to it. And then they get to a point where like, well, what happens on day 2 when the flooding rises to a certain, they're like, there is no, we have not mapped out how to react to this. And so the question, and I was not watching the game when it happened. It was more of like people texting and then trying to figure out what was going on, is why in all of these instances does it seem like there should be a binder step by step, and yet we feel like we're in disarray and making it up as we go along?
Well, there was a certain panic that took place, and it was obvious in watching this that everybody was in a panic, and that includes the broadcasters who were shocked by what was happening. I know, I mean, the volume was down, but Joe Buck's voice didn't even sound like Joe Buck, and nor did Troy Aikman's. They were stunned and horrified, and you're watching this in real time, and all I could think of was the number of times I've referred to football in print as a death sport. The number of times that people have said it's only a matter of time before X happens on the field. The number of times you see players get hit, to your point, Amin, and it always looks so bad. And then they get up and then we forget that they just got crunched. And now there's this. And it made me think, number one, that to have not seen the commissioner's face, that he didn't show his face, was a huge failure of leadership. And talk about failing the players, even from just an optics standpoint, to assure people that you care about this, that there is some moment where you put the rest of the business aside and that you do care about the people who are doing this. And when I was watching this, it was also disturbing to me that we don't know our own history in the story of Chuck Hughes. That Chuck Hughes died on the field in 1971 as a member of the Detroit Lions in a game at Tiger Stadium against the New Orleans Saints. And by the end of that story, it sounded somewhat similar to where we're heading with this one, where it happened to be not necessarily a freak accident, but it was a wrong moment at an incredibly precise, inopportune moment where these forces came together and cost this man his life, and all the lawsuits and allegations that followed. But nevertheless, it happened on a football field. And all of the things that we talk about with football can't be separated. We can't just say, oh, well, you know, it's a freak happening, because of all the other things that we know. When we think about Darryl Stingley being paralyzed in a preseason game, when you think about Mike Utley, or you think about Dennis Bird, or you think about Corey Stringer, that these things are part of it. And when Ryan Clark came on the air and he had his own incident, you know, when he was playing, to have Ryan Clark come on and say, when you are putting those pads on every Sunday, you are taking your life into your own hands. That was really chilling. And for him to say that, to say it the way he said it, made me also think, okay, well, what about us watching? And it made me think about the lack of professional respect that a lot of people have for football players and for athletes in general, when they talk about how, oh, well, you know, nobody put a gun to your head, and so you know the risks. Well, that doesn't mean that there aren't risks just because you know the risks. And it made me think about everyone, you know, that even to Kate's point about the way that the players talk about themselves, next man up, and they inject that fungibility into the sport, embedded into the sport. And I understand the other piece of it. I understand the piece that says that, okay, we win as a team and everyone's going to contribute, which is also what next man up means. But also the way that sounded, it sounded so grotesque at that moment, all of the language that we associate with this game. And I just thought it was very, very difficult to separate from that. And I also had, as disappointing and as tough as it was to listen, you also had to have some compassion for people trying to make sense of this. Maybe it was a simple panic move to immediately start talking about the schedule and when the game was going to get replayed, and whether or not the NFL really did come out and say, okay, we're going to have a 5-minute warm-up period and then we're going to go back to live action. But then you think about going back to live action, and how many times have we watched the game where somebody says there's an injured Bronco on the field, and then they go to a commercial, and then they sell some beer and sell some cars, and then they do go back to live action.
Right. Well, the example I thought of immediately to that point, Howard, was Ryan Shazier of the Steelers, who was paralyzed. And, the scene played out very similarly. Obviously, it wasn't a case of life or death, but players were crying and people were emotional, and everyone was shaken up, clearly. And we went to commercial, and then we played the rest of the game. And I'm no doubt that hung over everybody's mind as they went out there and continued to play or coach or ref that game. But they did it. So in a weird way, the precedent says that, no, that's not a out of the question conversation at all, because when have they ever stopped?
That's what we do.
Yeah,
that's what we exactly. That's what they do.
And just like Howard, you mentioned Ryan Clark. I think someone I listened to on Mina Kimes' podcast, Dominique Foxworth, talking about how every time, similar to Ryan, every time you put on those pads, that the risk that you are taking is the most extreme. Not that it is likely to happen, but that it is possible that it may happen. And I think that at least for me, I haven't watched football in a number of years, but up until I was about 36, I watched pretty much every minute of NFL every Sunday. I wish I could say I stopped because it was violent, and it was actually, my dad died and he was the one who loved the Giants. And I always watched to be able to talk to him about it. And when he was gone, I didn't really feel the same compulsion to watch the game every week. It wasn't like a moral decision that it was, too violent for me to watch. But in my absence from it, and having spent more time watching soccer, when I come back to it, I'm like, you're almost blindsided, for the pun there, but like you're almost blindsided by how violent it actually is. But I think the point that I was trying to get to is definitely people should listen to the Dominique conversation on Mina's podcast, where he points out that they are, every time you put on the pads, you're aware. I don't think as a fan or as a past fan of the NFL that I even have a moment of gratitude for the players before I watch. Like I had not even acknowledged that as an ongoing acknowledgement. And I think that there's probably millions of fans out there, and there's a lot of questions about what we could do, right? Like, how can you change football? What is going to be the aftermath of this moment, if any? Because usually history shows us that you just wait a couple of weeks and we're back at it, and there's not a whole lot of change. But I think one thing that I became aware of in listening to Dominique is, like, if these players are putting on these pads and know that they're taking their lives into their hands, like, shouldn't we as fans, even if you're going to continue watching, at least have a moment where we acknowledge that? Because I think there's other things I may watch that may be more like outwardly risky. I mean, even sitting down in a plane and taking off in a plane, I have a moment before we take off where I have some level of awareness about what we are about to endeavor upon. And I think that lack of awareness is something that maybe can be like a slight shift that we see fans make, but I think that I might be being a little Pollyanna-ish about that.
Well, to the airplane point, I am always and forever conflicted flying to Latin America, where it's in the Latino culture to cheer when the plane lands.
Right.
And on the one hand, I remember the first time that it happened, I remember thinking, that's really kind of cool in a way. But then again, I was like, what did y'all think was going to happen?
Right. Was this the unlikely outcome that we landed?
Yeah. And so I think that to me, one of the pieces of this that is really important, and the reason why I was asking you about football is because for me, part of the reason I'll never forget, Patriots were playing the Saints, and there was a play. Stephen Ridley took the ball off tackle, I believe. He got smashed, fumbled the ball. Saints recover. 1st and 10, New Orleans. And they show the play in slow motion. And when Ridley gets hit, he's unconscious. You can see he's out on his feet. And the ball slips free, and there's the end of the play. And the broadcasters did not make a single mention of the fact that when we're watching this replay 2 or 3 times, you can see he's out. And they talked about how if you're going to play for Bill Belichick, ball security is really important. You got to be able to hold on to the football. And I was like, fuck, this is fucking barbaric. And I'm like, you know what? Then I'm looking at myself going, you're making a deal that this is all right for you, that this is your entertainment. And I was like, this isn't my entertainment. And I really love football in a lot of ways because it is a brilliant, wonderful, violent, fast, strategic game. But the question I had been asking myself, especially in the backdrop of a lot of these young Black athletes, or 70% of the game, who can't get jobs in the sport afterwards, who aren't really considered for other positions, who are next man up and very fungible. I've been asking myself, okay, well, how much of this do you want to be your entertainment? And then also when you see something like this, as we keep talking about it, it reminds me a little bit of COVID, where when we get into the pandemic and the anti-vaxxers would say things like, well, you know, you've got a 99.5% chance of survival. Well, death is not the only barometer for me. Being paralyzed like Shazier, there are other, or Dennis Bird, that there are other things here that really affect your quality of life. And I've just been asking the question, when this happened on Monday, has bigger, faster, stronger finally run its course? And is there something that we have to acknowledge about what we are accepting for entertainment? Someone asked me the other day, well, what do you propose to make football safer, or what is the next step for this? And, you know, if you don't want to be cynical and you don't want to go back to, well, you know, after a couple of weeks, we all just go back to normal. Part of me thinks about going back to the future. Part of me thinks that maybe the invincibility of the sport needs to be stripped down and you need to go back to playing without helmets. You think twice. Maybe the pads can't be as big as they are. I don't know if that's naive because the players are so damn big now and the drugs are so good and the body fat is non-existent that you can't go back. But this is a moment to me where you look at this and you think about, and also as a professional, you can't have $1 million journalists without $10 million players, without $100 million players. We're all in many ways, not that we're millionaires, but we're profiting from this dynamic that we're watching.
Yeah. I mean, because one of the things I've been thinking about since Monday was like a lot of things that happen in sports, Hamlin is just the tip of the iceberg of a much bigger, he is representative of a much bigger issue. In the same way when Corey Stringer died, or when a player has died, whether in the college or the pro level, of like heat exposure, you know, in 2-a-days. You're like, you could get stuck in the details of specifically what happened on Monday night or what has happened in the past, or you actually, because there's not a lot of places to go in that conversation. Or you step back and you ask, like, why did this happen and what does it mean? And in the case of other players, whether it's like, you know, over coaching at the college level and changes in regulations that need to be made, or generational trauma at the college level. And in this case, it's like everything we've seen in sports when we have a moment that is captured on video, but it is representative of so much more, whether it's what Dominique Foxworth was talking about the fact that, you know, he was pointing out that Hamlin has not even vested into having his 5 years of healthcare post-playing career. So he would have no healthcare if he were to survive these weeks, this catastrophic incident. So and it is representative of what we see on the field week in and week out that may not coalesce into the moment we saw on Monday night, but it's It is everything we always talk about. It is all of the reasons you might, if you allow yourself to feel a little bit uncomfortable every time you turned on a football game, if you were aware enough to feel that feeling, the moment on Monday night was all of those things crammed into like a singular televised event.
Yeah, that's right.
To highlight that point, by the way, one of the big stories that's come out of this is Hamlin had a charity toy drive, and people have been donating to it. It's surpassed $6.5 million now. You know what his goal was?
2,500.
2,500. And all I could think of is that's the goal set by someone who understands I'm not that rich and I'm not that famous, and I just want like a nice achievable, limit to hit. And that combined with what Dominique said about hey, I don't have the years of service to qualify for the post-playing career healthcare. It just oftentimes we talk about the fortune that these guys make, and somehow kind of play that as that's the old line from Mad Men, that's what the money's for, right? But a lot of these guys don't make money, or not like I'm set for the rest of my life money. Not even I'm set for a couple of years money. And as I think about that, as I think about the risk involved in playing this sport, Hamlin, by the way, signed a 4-year, $3.6 million contract. That's
It's a lot of money, but that's not I can never work again money.
Yeah,
after,
that's not
after
it's not I'm set for life. And it's certainly not I can afford my massive healthcare expenses when this is, if I see the other end of this. And so I wonder, as you ask Howard about, where to go, how we go in the future, I'm thinking, is the hazard pay high enough for these guys? Because it doesn't sound like it.
Well, that is the reason. I mean, isn't all of this the reason why there were no guaranteed contracts in the first place?
Yeah. Right.
Because these guys get busted
this could happen to you
so badly. Well, because you get busted up so badly, we'd be paying everybody for forever, and they wouldn't be playing that long. It's like, exactly. That's exactly
because right. The sport is so risky, we can't guarantee you anything. That is the backwards nature of it.
Well, and that's what I mean when you talk about this, and all the different things come, into play, and they do fall into relief when you think about what the game is as a sport that could cost you your life, or that that this is, what do they always say? Football is the one sport with the 100% injury rate. It is a death sport in a lot of ways. And whether you look at it as a 24-year-old who happens to have an unfortunate accident on the field that does not happen very often, or if your body is so beaten and bruised and your brain is beaten and bruised that you are Junior Seau or Dave Durson, or right. if you were an offensive lineman, and because you play in the offensive line in the National Football League, your average life expectancy is 59 years old, which is almost 20 years less than that of the average couch potato who's watching you. All of these things do come into play, and all of these things do have to be considered when you're thinking about this. And then also, when you say, well, that's what the money's for. That's also one of the things that gives people license to believe they can abuse these players.
Right.
That they can just say and do whatever they want. But then you could hear a pin drop in that stadium on Monday. And so, to Kate's point, all of these things, this perfect storm brings us back to the center. And I understand the idea that, well, the machine is so great that there's nothing we can do. But it is important to remember that you can't have it both ways. We can't sit and talk about how the NFL trounces every single program on Sunday Night Football. That how Sunday Night Football is the biggest, highest rated thing ever, and how the NFL destroyed even the NBA on Christmas, which is the day that belongs to the NBA. That football dwarfed that because Christmas fell on a Sunday. You can't have all of that, and you can't talk about the invincibility of the NFL without carrying this piece of it too.
I mean, it maybe I'm made most painfully clear now than I have ever been, how intertwined all of what you just said is. Like the reasons we love it, the reasons the players can never get leverage is because of their necessity of being disposable according to the owners, because there's so many injuries, because it's so risky, the big business of it, the performance of, like,
Kate,
these are, yeah, go ahead.
And to them, where they're like, listen, I can't go on strike. I only got 2 years to do this.
Yep.
Right.
I can't afford to care about myself labor-wise. I can't afford to protect myself because someone else is going to be out there to take my job, because this window is smaller than ever, especially if I'm a running back, right? Then that position doesn't even really exist anymore because it's so fungible. That position used to be one of the most glamorous, besides quarterback. That running back and quarterback were the most glamorous positions, and now the running back position is one of the least glamorous positions because you don't last. Now that salary actually is going down.
Yep. And it's that the nature, and in addition to all that, it's like this idea that, like, the nature of football is that it's one unit, including the colors, the brand, the field, the stadium, like, in a way that we just haven't seen basketball be for so long. And that is all wrapped up in what has made football king. And so, when we ask these questions of, like, well, how can the NFL change, to your point, Howard, of, like, do we go to no helmets? Do we go to flag football? Does it
want
Does it even want to change? It has no desire to change. And I think that when I look at football, one of the more grotesque things that we do in football, language-wise, is this, and the NFL does it on purpose, is this ridiculous and incessant half-century worth of tying football to the military.
Yeah.
Well, in one of the areas where it is actually somewhat true, is you are sacrificing your life and you are sacrificing your body for this lifestyle, that this is going to be the way that you're going to set up your family. And if you are the sacrificial lamb for that, then so be it. And I've talked to players about this. It's not just me spitballing here. I remember talking to players saying, look, even at the end of this, okay, I'm going to have trouble walking and I'm going to need 10 surgeries or whatever. But for where I was coming from, there was no other way to be a responsible parent or to set my family up, which is not that different than hearing people say, well, that's why I joined the Army. It was the only pathway for me. And even though there's huge differences in the salaries, the sentiment is the same. I am willing to put my body at risk for this life.
For financial security.
For the financial security. And that once again, for everything that we've talked about evolution and change and history, that for a lot of these Black male athletes especially, it's still your body is the commodity here, because most of these guys aren't on the Sean McVay path to being in the NFL for 50 years. They're on the path of being in the NFL for a short time, as long as their body allows. They're two different trajectories, even though they're in the same industry.
Well, it's tough because I think about compensation and how that compensation could be higher, but not really, because as you pointed out, if we're collectively bargaining, then it makes it pretty much impossible to convince the majority of the voting constituency that, hey, passing up on checks is worth it, because we're all going to make more money at the end of it, which, by the way, I'm not convinced that's always the purpose of a union. It's not so that we can all make more money. It's usually so that the guys at the top can make even more money, which does not change much for the people at the bottom. But at the same time, this is a sport that generates a massive amount of wealth. And at the very least, if we're going to say these guys are going to risk their lives, and we're even willing to say, hey, we're going to do it non-guaranteed contracts, at the very least, can we get them some more money?
Yeah.
to account for this massive risk that they undertake every Sunday?
Yeah,
Kate,
if we're what's that?
I'm going to say Kate has bigger, faster, stronger run its course.
It doesn't seem so. I mean, like,
From a business standpoint, I mean, from watching this, can these human bodies continue to do this without just making the complete trade-off that every now and then you're going to get a Damar Hamlin?
I think that seems to be the pact deal with the devil that America has made with football. And to Amin's point, I mean, you know, we're sitting here and, you know, talking about like, will this have any lasting effect? I don't think it will. I don't think much is going to change. I think maybe to Amin's point, the one thing that you would maybe hope you could get the players a little bit more leverage come collective bargaining agreement. If people, I don't think this will happen, because by the time that rolls around, this will be so far in the rearview mirror. But I mean, this is the kind of thing, it's like, you know, does it warm my heart that Hamlin's Toy Drive now has 6+ million? Yes, I think that that's great. Do I think that what would make more change in the game is if everybody did that? Plus, when it came collective bargaining agreement time, they weren't shitting all over the players and being like, just take your check and be happy. And we could actually, to Amin's point, be like, that is what the money's for, to some degree. Like, if we've made this deal with the devil for football, then let's have lifetime healthcare sport. I know this is like pie in the sky, but like, if we agreed that this game is something we need as Americans, then pay the players something that is like inheritance level money and healthcare that does cover post-playing career. Because the way it is right now is like a few $100,000 after taxes for most of these guys, and most of them not even vesting into any kind of healthcare. And we haven't even talked about the college game, which would be impacted by whatever the NFL did, and where there's a lot of guys coming in who have already been hit in so many ways that it doesn't matter. You could play 2 games in the NFL and still have the rest of your life affected by the game.
And the game is also affecting you before you even get there, as you were saying, college and high school. There are stories of these things happening every year.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the sport.
Question: when we look at, because there aren't professional football leagues all over the world, it's the NFL and college football, and that's pretty much it. When we look at the closest corollaries, rugby and Aussie rules football, are they experiencing the same type of reckoning that we are? Or is it because they don't wear pads, it's a less violent game because people naturally are not going to launch themselves like a missile when they know, oh, I can hurt too?
Well, exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's why there has been these questions of going back to the future. And now, obviously, the reason why you went from the past to the future in the first place was because when you had the leather helmets on and no facial shields, people were getting their eyes gouged out, right? So that's why you put a face mask on there. And the reason why you had a different shell of a helmet was because guys were still leading with their head because they're warriors. And so it was like, wait a minute, a leather helmet is not a deterrent to keep these guys from smashing at each other and spearing each other and leading with their heads. So maybe it is simply a romantic wish that cannot be fulfilled, that once you put football players on the field, they're going to use their bodies like projectiles, because that's what it is. And at this stage in the game, you can't go backwards. And I don't know if that is true or not, but I would like to think that knowing that you don't have a shell on your head, the way that, you know, would make you think twice at the size of these guys. And also one other thing, I mean, you can go on this. The other thing on this too is when I ask the question if bigger, faster, stronger has run its course, let's also not forget that when I was in high school, which was in the 80s, very few guys weighed 300 pounds. In fact, right. the 49ers used to fine players for being overweight. Bubba Paris used to battle with his weight. Number 77, by the way, Kate Fagan. We'll get to
daughter
that.
Courtney and Ashley Paris, who played for Oklahoma Sooners. There we go.
Right? And so I think he used to get fined for any pound he was over 300. So, you know, they have talked about some of these other things, weight limits and bringing guys down and the whole thing, and that there are ways to do this if you want to consider them, but do we want to consider them?
Yeah.
So here's my fear, Howard, is that if you remove protective equipment, I think if we said in time, I think yes, things will go down because people are going to be less inclined to turn themselves into projectiles without all that protection. The problem is, before that decline happens, you're going to get a bloodbath of all the guys figuring out, like, no, or just figuring out, oh, I can't play like that
This
anymore.
is what it's like without a helmet. Yeah.
And that, I think, might be the disastrous moment that turns people off of the sport. If they see a bunch of mangled bodies for the first, I don't know how many weeks, months, even years before the players and the system and the sport adapts to can't play like that anymore, have to do something else. Weight limits, though. Weight limits is interesting because we have that in combat sports.
That's right.
So would weight limits do something? I don't know.
Also expanding the field and making it, you know, maybe not longer, but certainly wider. So there's more open space, but of course, more open space gives you more time to gear up and reach top speed, nail somebody. But still,
and also, hell, after these guys are running for their lives to get to the sideline, now you put the sideline further. What are you doing, Howard?
You're asking for a different sport, and I think that this is. I think, you know, as we wrap this up, I think that the real question here is the one that I think Kate brought up earlier, which is, if this is not a reckoning of some sort, then we are deciding that we've made a deal to have this $1 billion, $25 billion industry by the end of the decade, that's going to be the vision. And, you know, these are going to be things that we accept going forward. And that's a really hard place to be when you see things happen the way they played out on Monday. We will see you next week or whenever we appear. I think it's next week. It'll be Meadowlarkers 62. I'm just going to go straight up and say Java Chamberlain. As 62 goes, it's going to get more and more and more difficult to get to our honorary guest. We also will have many things to talk about. One thing we didn't do, and it's too late now because I think we've already crossed our threshold as well of, like, when does the threshold end of saying Happy New Year to people? First week, 5 days? Like, when does that actually end?
I'm done with it already.
Not even the Happy New Year. So we're done officially, which also means we were done actually having we never did our 2022 retrospective. So maybe we'll talk about some things that we might be looking forward to in 2023, perhaps, or we'll just roll like we always roll.
That's right, roll.
Exactly. And last but not least, Maxim Afinagenov, number 61 Buffalo Sabres. That was
full circle. Full circle.
Full circle. We'll see you next week.